As Gregory mentioned before, I am the head of communications for the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at Duke Law. But most of you on this call probably know me best as in my previous role as a reporter at NC Policy Watch, where I covered redistricting pretty extensively. But I'm also joined by Tyler Dukes, who's an investigative reporter at the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he specializes in data and public records. In 2017, he completed a fellowship at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. And prior to joining the News and Observer, he worked as an investigative reporter on the state politics team at WRAL News. He's also the former managing editor of the Duke University's Reporters Lab, where he researched tools and techniques for reducing the cost of investigative journalists. And also joining us is Blake Esselstyn. He's a North Carolina-based geographer, demographer, and redistricting consultant who first began studying geographic information systems more than 25 years ago. His professional experience includes over a decade of working in local government as the GIS specialist for the City of Asheville Planning Department, where he served as the city's liaison to the US Census Bureau and presented often at public meetings. He's served as an expert witness and consulting expert for multiple court cases and has been invited to speak at 6 North Carolina universities and several redistricting conferences in other states. So we've got a great panel here today. And I just want to kick everything off by asking Tyler, can you give us a quick kind of rundown on where things are right now with redistricting in North Carolina?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Melissa. So, you know, one of the big question marks right now is what the timeline is really going to look like going forward. Just as a reminder to set the stage here, the census results, which sort of trigger this redistricting process every 10 years, or at least the formal process. North Carolina works a little different, a little more frequent. But that census data was delayed by several months. So this would normally be a process that we would see happening early on in the year. And so there is sort of a scramble now to get this work done. So we're in the public comment period right now. We will be for the next, I think, day or two. There's 1 or 2 more of those public comment periods taking place. But those public comment periods are being done without maps to talk about yet.
Okay.
And so our expectation is that we're going to see some of that map drawing done in public. Mm-hmm. The legislative leaders have committed to that. And so when that's going to happen, not exactly sure, but expect that over the next couple of weeks.
Okay. And that we can expect maybe to look similar to the redistricting process last time with the court order, where there'll be live streams and the public can attend and watch kind of lawmakers draw maps on computers.
Right. And that's been the commitment from Republican leaders who are steering this process. They've talked a lot about transparency and wanting to take some of the techniques that they used in 2019, some of which were court ordered, and actually use them this cycle.
Okay. And Blake, can you tell us a little bit about, what we should know and how our residents can watch along and know what they're looking at?
I sure can. And this would seem like an opportune moment. Thank you, Melissa, by the way, for the intros, and thank you to the organizers, and thanks to all the folks who are participating. I'm going to share my screen, and I can see the button, but I am getting a message that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm going to, I'll talk a little bit before I can share. There we go. Boom. Okay. I trust that everyone can see a title slide.
Looks good.
Great. So we can talk a little bit about criteria. And this is something that Tyler alluded to, but this is just a list of the criteria that have been adopted by the General Assembly. And I don't expect everybody to read all these words, and I'm certainly not going to read them. We've got an abbreviated version here. So basically, the left-hand column is the things that are going to be considered, and the right-hand column are the things that are explicitly not going to be considered. So you can see here that as the process moves forward, what the General Assembly has adopted as a criteria: equal population is a legal requirement, contiguity is a legal requirement. We'll talk a little bit more about preserving counties. That's actually related to the North Carolina Constitution. And then preserving precincts intact, trying to make districts compact, consideration of municipal boundaries, consideration of where incumbents live, and then also, if all the others are met, a consideration of communities. So these are the guiding principles, if you will, as the General Assembly moves forward. And this
just
is
to jump in, Blake, one thing I was wondering about is do they have any sort of weight in, like, will one be considered more than the other, or is that that's just a list and then they'll decide how they'll consider them?
Good question. My understanding, you'll see that this is a bullet list and not a numbered list. They're not, as I understand it, not explicitly ranked, but you can see, for example, community consideration, they do explicitly say, so long as a plan complies with the foregoing criteria. So, and it's also maybe worth pointing out here that there is some language here. It says that member residents, in other words, where incumbents live, may be considered, but it doesn't say if that's being considered in order to prevent putting two incumbents in the same district. That was made explicit in 2019, that avoiding the pairing of incumbents in one district was to be avoided. Here, that language is not explicit. Similarly, municipal boundaries. Does that mean trying to keep municipal boundaries intact? It's not clear. It just says the committees may consider municipal boundaries when drawing districts.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, thank you. So this is a photo from an NPR journalist from the 2019 process. Obviously, this was pre-COVID, but you can see a bunch of legislators gathered around a staff person who's got her hand on a mouse steering the computer, and you can see a colorful map on the computer screen. And the legislators are all weighing in on where these boundaries go. And you can sort of see that parts of the area that they're looking at are shaded yellow, green, blue, red. And this was a lot. There were hours and hours of this going on, and it was made available on the web. This is a screenshot. I've been unable to find the actual videos anymore, but you can see that at the time they were posted on YouTube. And there's the top left has an image of the actual chamber, and then the other three are actually screencasts. So you could see the software, the mapping software in process as the shapes were being drawn and changed and considered. And do take a moment just to see that you on these screens, you'll see something that looks like a roadmap, and then the other prominent feature are these shaded shapes. And some of you may recognize the parts of the state that you see in these maps. And because the YouTube videos are no longer available, I was not able to actually get a quality image to zoom in on footage from 2019. But this, you can see in the upper left-hand corner here, this is actually from a workstation at the General Assembly. This is their software. And this is a screenshot that I took using that, what used to be a publicly available workstation.
And one thing to note, just quickly, is during that 2019 session, even though there were live streams of the room, there was not audio. So a session like this is helpful if they do decide to go that route again this year, to be able to kind of look at the screen and understand what's going on if you don't have someone talking or can't hear the discussion behind what changes are being made on the screen.
And I do remember hearing audio, but it was unreliable, let's say. And so just very briefly, a sort of tour of this interface. On the left-hand side here, it's kind of like a table of contents of all the layers that can be displayed. And the ones that are in green with the check marks are layers that are part of this map. So the key ones here are the census block and the voting district. Those are kind of the building blocks. And if we jump over to the map here, like this number that I'm circling with my cursor is, that is the population of that voting district, which is also more commonly known as a precinct. The big numbers here are the district numbers. And then the little numbers are the block populations. So this is typical of what I watched. What I remember seeing is very much consideration of the precinct and block shapes and the number of people in them. Very much a focus on that. And we'll circle back later to what other things might be considered as part of the process. But a lot of what you will see is shapes like this. Now, this table up top is a summary of statistics for each of the districts. Again, you can see districts 8, 9, and 10 here. By the way, this is just a hypothetical plan that I came up with 10 districts. This is not, should not be taken as representation of anything that actually happened. And then this column is the all-important percent deviation. And for congressional districts, this has to essentially be reduced to 0 or as close to 0 as possible. For legislative districts, it has to be within plus or minus 5%. So that's what you're seeing here. And then over here, this table is a preview. So what's selected here in red is a collection of blocks. And this is previewing what would happen to the district populations if I were to commit these changes. And that happens in this little toolbox down here. If I click on this checkbox, these would all be then transferred to the active district here. You can see in that toolbox, the active target district is District 8. And I realize this may be a lot to digest. We'll be doing a demo with a different software, but this, I wanted to make sure people were familiar with what Maptitude looked like. And I know I've been talking a lot. I'm going to say one more thing. You'll see that this, when I used the software at the General Assembly, there were a lot of columns in this table. These are all election related data, and that had been loaded into the General Assembly's computers for the 2016 process. But if we look back at these, you'll see that the table only has 3 columns. That's population, the deviation in terms of the number of people, and the percent deviation. And there are no other columns because in the 2019 process, as with this year's process, they have said that they will not be considering demographic data, racial data. When I say demographic data, I should be more specific. Any data about race or ethnicity, and they will not be considering election data.
Great, thank you, Blake. And we will be taking questions toward the end of this panel, but I did think there was a great question that that popped up that could be good to answer before moving forward. Do you know yet what mapping software will be used for the upcoming redistricting cycle? Has it been decided?
Yes, I have communicated with staff at the General Assembly, and they're using Maptitude again. And the current, there have been some minor changes since this. You can see this, this was done in 2020, right before COVID, February of 2020. But there have, the interface should look very much the same.
Okay, thank you.
Tyler, do you want to talk about the county grouping? Because that's an important part of understanding the legislative redistricting process.
Yeah, absolutely. And Blake, you can actually probably come in and correct me in a couple of these places, since I know you've been doing a lot of the hands-on work with this. But, you know, Blake mentioned that there are these criteria that determine specifically, you know, these traditional criteria that lots of map makers and lots of states use. And then there are some specific for North Carolina. And one of them in particular is this concept of county groupings. So this is derived effectively from the state constitution, which places a really high priority on not splitting counties up. But as Blake mentioned, the equal population requirements for the legislature and congressional races mean that sometimes you have to figure out ways to either combine or split counties, or, you know, try to figure out a way to, you know, to group them in a way that is consistent with the Constitution. So as a result of a couple of one specific court case, there has essentially emerged this formula. It's just a step-by-step process for trying to determine how the counties in a legislative map, House and Senate, should be grouped. And one of the things that's interesting about that is it sort of reduces the universe of these maps that can potentially be drawn. So you've got, in some cases, there are some choices, but in a lot of cases, what this means is that there's going to be a group of counties, and that group of counties is going to have a specific number of districts that map makers are going to have to go and sort of slice and dice from there. And they can't pull in other counties or they would risk having those maps be invalidated pretty quickly under the rules of the state constitution. So the technical aspect of that, though, Blake and some of his colleagues have specifically looked at that, and they have essentially said, here are what the groupings are going to be. Again, there are a couple of options, but in a lot of these cases, there's only one solution to that formula, one grouping that lawmakers have to use. Hopefully I did that justice, Blake.
I think that was great. That was great. And we should point out that two of the previous panelists, Jonathan Mattingly and Gregory Hirschlag, did most of the heavy lifting for running the algorithm this time around and producing the map that we're looking at. Their original paper had some other authors as well, but Gregory and Jonathan did the vast majority of that work. And so looking at this map, what this map is showing is groupings for the Senate, the North Carolina State Senate. And the areas that show up in colors are groupings that are set. In other words, the algorithm only came up with one possible arrangement of those counties. And I'm going to focus on this one here where my cursor is, which is Guilford County on the south and Rockingham County on the north. Guilford County is where Greensboro is. And the 3 here indicates that this will have 3 Senate districts that are contained in those 2 counties. By the way, all the areas in gray are yet to be determined, unless something has happened this morning that I'm not aware of. The General Assembly has choices for each of those gray areas. There are 2 options to choose from as far as how they're grouped. And so those are still up in the air, but all the areas showing in color have their clusters determined. And as Tyler mentioned, there are some that only have 1 district, like this pairing here of counties where essentially redistricting is over for them as far as their state Senate district. It's done. And there are a number of other single district clusters that I'm pointing to now. And so our exercise is going to be focusing on this Guilford and Rockingham County pair. And as Tyler said, this is sort of creates a nice limited redistricting exercise because we've got 2 counties and have to divide them into 3 districts. So that's something we can do in a relatively short amount of time. And without further ado, I'm going to share a different screen. And what we are going to be looking at is a different piece of software called QGIS, which is a free and open source software. And I have installed in this mapping software a plugin for redistricting, which was created by an individual and is also available free of charge. So can folks see this mapping application now?
Looks good, Blake.
Great. Okay, so what we've got here, just to orient folks, is similar to what we were looking at in the General Assembly's Maptitude. You can see, and if I turn these off, again, Rockingham County to the north and Guilford County to the south. And the table here is where we will see the district information change as I am adding or subtracting the precincts. We're just, for the purposes of this, we're just going to be working with precincts. Again, there's very clear language in the criteria that precincts should not be split if at all possible. So precincts are our building blocks here. And you'll see the population change as I make some changes here. And then this deviation number, this column here, is the key column because we're needing to get the numbers in here, the percentage in here, to between -5% and +5%. So do the panelists have any suggestions for how I should start drawing a district here?
Well, I do want to put just a sort of finer point on this idea of equal population, just so we can keep some numbers in our head. So, as we mentioned, the census and the count of every person in North Carolina is what triggers this, and sort of dividing these districts up into equal populations is sort of a center line spine of this process. But just in raw numbers, what we're talking about, we're looking, North Carolina has a population of about 10 million, according to that census. And so what we typically refer to when you're talking about, what your population target is the ideal population. So 50 state Senate districts, which puts the ideal population at 211,000 people. Now, as Blake mentioned a minute ago, there is a little bit of wiggle room with state legislative districts. So there's a plus or minus 5% margin. So we're looking at 211,000, give or take 10,000 or so. So that's the target. And so when we talk about deviation, we're saying how far away from that are we going to go? And if it's over 5, we're in trouble. And so one of the things that we might want to do just starting out is think about compactness. That's one of the criteria here. And what that means essentially is we want to make shapes kind of look pretty, right? We want them to be maybe a square or a circle, depending on the formula that you use. And so if you are, just starting out and you want to play around with this, maybe we prioritize compactness as our top priority and see how close we can get to dividing this up into 3 different districts.
Great. And so I'm going to be considering compactness. By the way, a couple other notes. So since Rockingham County's population it's about 1/7 of the population of this total cluster. So Guilford County's population is 7 times that of Rockingham. So it does not make sense to split Rockingham. And so we know that Rockingham County is going to be on its own. And so I'm going to put it in District 1. And since I know that it's less than, certainly less than 1/3 of the population, I'm going to include some precincts from Guilford County as well. And I'm going to be doing some things with keyboard shortcuts. So you won't see me clicking on this button here, for example, update selected polygons. Well, I'll do it this time. But I've gotten in the habit of using keyboard shortcuts, which are a nice feature of this tool. And so often you'll just see things sort of magically changing.
And Blake, you mentioned that this is a tool anybody could use to kind of play around and practice with.
That's right. There are a number of web-based tools as well that are simpler. This might be considered more of a power user tool, but yes, this is all openly, freely available. What I'm working with right now.
Yeah, I'm as Blake is working with that too. I'm curious about Melissa's take on this because you have been covering, or prior to your current role, did a lot of coverage of redistricting. You were in DC for a big Supreme Court case in which North Carolina was sort of center stage here. I mean, how this idea of technology, not just the stuff that is in the hands of lawmakers and map makers and experts, but we all have this technology, right? I mean, it seems like this has had a really profound impact on the way we draw these maps.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword, if you will. It's great to have the technology, but and it's great that people at home can practice and follow along. But it's also easy to use the technology for, as we've seen in North Carolina, for purposes of gerrymandering, either politically or by race. And so, technology, gerrymandering is something that has been in existence forever. This is not something new that only Republicans do or only Democrats have done. It's something that everyone has done, but technology has only made it easier. On the flip side of that, it's great to have this technology where people can use this at home. They can follow along with their legislators. They can ask questions like, what if we focus on compactness? Or what if we wanted to keep Greensboro whole? What would that look like? What would it look like if we did gerrymander a district? Is it possible to, keep the A&T campus whole? These are all questions that people might have throughout the process, and that they could potentially kind of log on and figure out for themselves as well.
Yeah, and we're going to play around with a couple of these ideas because, what I think is so crucial to understand about the redistricting process is that you've got, in many cases, competing priorities, right? And there's no single answer to how a map should be drawn in a lot of cases, with the exception of some of these places where there's a single district, or states where there's a single district. I mean, you really have to make some choices and weigh some of these considerations. And in a way, that's kind of fundamentally a political process, right?
Absolutely.
Tyler and Melissa have been making some important points, and folks may have just sort of noticed me clicking away, and maybe have noticed that the populations here are now getting close to the ideal district population. By the way, if you want to reference that, I know Tyler mentioned it before, but the target population is listed over here, as well as the lower end of the range and the higher end of the range. And so I'm trying to go for kind of rectangles. And I've gotten this software gives a nice signal that you've gotten within the accepted range. When I set up this plan, I said that the plus or minus 5% was the acceptable range. I'm going to try and fill in a little bit more of this to make it more rectangular.
And Blake, we've got a good question. Somebody asked, what are the separate areas that you are coloring in that comprise a district?
Good question. So you can maybe see here that the layer that's selected is VTDs. The cluster references the cluster of counties. I have heard that the General Assembly might be using the word pod this time for groups of counties instead of clusters. But anyway, the cluster VTDs, VTD stands for a voting district, which is the census's term for a precinct. So these are the precincts that determine where you vote if you vote on election day for a general election. And they typically have somewhere in the neighborhood of a few thousand people. And thank you for that question. One thing I didn't point out that might be helpful to note here is that the areas where you see that the precincts are smaller indicate, because as I said, the goal is to have these precincts have roughly the same number of people so that you don't have a polling place get overwhelmed. So the ones that are smaller means that you've got more people living in a smaller amount of space. So this area here in the center of Guilford County is Greensboro. And this here in the southwest is part of High Point. High Point actually straddles into multiple counties, but the basic geography of Guilford County, you've the far and away the largest municipality is Greensboro here, and then there's a bit of High Point here. So I have been just drawing these looking at compactness, and folks may have noticed that I did include these other columns here. Now, again, the General Assembly is not going to be considering race or election results, but it's interesting. And what I'm going to do right now is actually, I'm going to turn off this layer just to contemplate when it says that they're not including election data as part of the process. That may mean it's not in the software, but in some places, it's not hard to grasp what the political landscape looks like. So if folks want to look at this map for a moment or two and just let those color contrasts seep into your mind, you might do this, the night before or the morning before you go into work and still have a decent idea of where the D's and the R's are. Whether or not that's actually in the computer. One thing I should point out here too is that it may look like there's a lot more red here. There's certainly more area that is shaded red, but this cluster as a whole voted for Biden 58%. And so the measure that I'm using is just the two-party vote share of Biden and Trump in the latest presidential election. So this cluster voted on the whole 58% for President Biden. And go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, so I just wanted to note a couple of things about this that are just really interesting. If you think about a couple of factors when we say we're not going to consider racial data, we're not going to consider political data. There are proxies for this. How small is one of these precincts? That indicates it's a more densely populated area, probably more blue rather than red. And you also have to consider that a lot of these lawmakers know their districts really well because they campaign in them. So that's a consideration too, where there is still the potential that you could bring some of those factors to bear.
And I don't think we've got the time to get into the nuances here, but for those who prefer the circle way of looking at this, this tries to get around that sort of brain trick of seeing a lot of red and thinking it's mostly red. When you add the blue, this shows that why it might be a 58% rate or 58% number that Biden prevailed by. But we're going to say we're not looking at this in terms of drawing the map. And I'm going to lock both of these districts. This is a nice feature that once those are locked, that means that I can select over here, and I'm going to assign these all to District 3. So now we've got these all within the plus or minus 5%. And we have information about, this is the non-Hispanic Black population as a percentage. This is the Hispanic population as a percentage. And this is for each district, the percent of Trump votes versus Biden votes in the 2020 election. So you can see in just drawing for compactness, we ended up with 2 safe districts, presumably. And I'm not a political scientist, and there may be ways to slice and dice this and look at votes for governor and look at other past elections or look at votes for the attorney general or auditor or who knows what. I'm just going with a simple familiar one. There may be metrics that other folks would recommend, but just as sort of a ballpark, you see that both the 2 southern districts are over 60% for Biden, and unsurprisingly, the one including Rockingham County, it looks like a safe vote for the Republican candidate, who happens to be the president pro tem of the Senate. So I did also want to just another layer here that we can turn on is the Greensboro boundary. So this, if folks are curious what actually is within the city limits of Greensboro, and remember municipalities are one of the criteria that the General Assembly might consider. You can see here, it's basically, I tried to gray out the rest of the cluster, and then what shows up brightly in here is within and it might be even clearer if I turn these off. That's the corporate limits of the city of Greensboro.
I think this brings up a really interesting point too, because again, we said, let's start with compactness and prioritize. But I mean, Melissa, when you look at a map like this, if you were, say, a Greensboro voter, would you be happy with this map?
I might wonder, if there was a way to keep Greensboro together. Is there a way to keep Greensboro whole somehow?
Right. Well, and if I think one of the things that, we think about here in compactness, we can measure that in some ways, but, again, we've got sort of a basic conflict here about, do we prioritize compactness or do we prioritize the wants and needs of the city that might say, look, we're all voting for the same city council. We're getting taxed in a similar way. We have, different kinds of questions that we might want a single representative to tackle. And, they might feel that is way more important than, making sure the shapes are sort of cutting in sort of squares and circles.
Sure. And just to kind of answer that question, it kind of goes back to that rule about equal population. So Greensboro population is about 299,000 or just a little over. And so it would not be possible given that the ideal population is 211,000, give or take that 5%. So what do what are some considerations in that, in not being able to keep Greensboro together? How do you decide where and how to split up a county like that? Blake, is that something that you can shed light on, or Tyler?
Well, I can mention that I think keeping municipalities whole is often held as a good idea. It's considered a community of interest, and preserving communities of interest is something that is often mentioned. The flip side of that is that it can, well, someone could argue too that rather than trying to just put it all in one district so that Greensboro has one senator in the state Senate representing it, and then some little bits and pieces around the edges. Some might argue that something more like those compact districts that split it in half would make sense, in that you'd have two senators who represent good chunks of Greensboro as well as other parts of Guilford County. Interestingly, I thought that if I were to put all of the precincts that are wholly within Greensboro in one district, that would be an easy way to achieve a 2-to-1 plan for the GOP. So in other words, my guess, and from having looked at the data, was that doing so would be kind of an easy way to get a very packed Democratic district in within the city limits of Greensboro. But I just switched over to a different plan. And so again, the area outside Greensboro is kind of grayed out. But just by including Greensboro, in other words, if I had made all of this into District 2, that didn't actually pack enough. So what I did was go through and try and maximize and get all the precincts I could that had the highest Democratic turnout. And you can see here that District 2, and I think I need to actually make one little change here. And I'm going to do this. And there we go. So that this table hadn't been updated. So if you were looking at the table before, you can disregard the numbers that were here. When I switched to that wholesale switch to a new plan, I needed to make a change in order for this to be triggered. But you can see that District 2 has near 80% support for Biden. And this, try as I might, I could not get two safe districts. Again, real politicos might question the metric as a good metric to use, but these are both, they got more votes for Trump than votes for Biden, but these would not be considered safe majorities. They're typically, you would want something that is at least 5%. Something like that, 55, 56, 57. And this might actually be considered a dummy mander, which is a term for something where you try to take as much as you can get, but then if you have a political swing election, one of these more competitive districts like the orange district here might actually go away different than what you had hoped for. So this is what—
I don't know that I've heard a dummy mander before. That's great.
Okay.
Well, I think this underscores a really important point, because we talked about how you can still kind of have political considerations in your head. These sort of approximations or even some proxies for political votes or sort of racial breakdowns. But one of the things we saw in previous cycles is that these it wasn't proxies, it wasn't approximations. It was really precise engineering to try to figure out not just can we create safe districts or majority districts, it was can we build districts that can withstand changes in the electorate's political votes. So what we would see were maps that were not responsive when there was a blue wave effectively. And that's one of the things you can potentially lose, your inability to do that sort of engineering, if you don't have that sort of on the ground precision, because you need more in that scenario than just Trump and Biden. You need several elections. you might want to pull in some other data that's relevant, that is a really good corollary for political persuasion. And there's all kinds of stuff like that political scientists can use to sort of tell exactly how a electorate is going to vote, even in a place where you might have a blue wave or a red wave. So being able to strip some of that away, it does pull precision out of the process. And what we may see as a result of a sort of blanket ban on racial and political data probably more than racial data to some degree, is not as much of that engineering. So we might see less extreme gerrymandering than what we saw and what the courts have ruled they saw in past cycles.
And that kind of gets to another question that we have in the chat, which is, can we expect more fair maps this time around?
That's the question, right? I mean, I think, for those of you who sat in on, Jonathan Mattingly and some of his colleagues, Jen's session earlier today, one of the things that I think we have now that we did not have in 2011 or even in 2016 is some better tools for trying to figure that out. But, when I have conversations about this with people, I think one of the things I try to point out is that gerrymandering is in the concept of fairness. It's not a binary. It's not 0 and 1. It's a spectrum, I think. And so the question is not, are we going to get fair maps? The question is not, are we going to have gerrymandering maps or gerrymandered maps? The question is, how extreme are those gerrymanders? How unfair are they? And trying to figure out what is acceptable to us in the balance of all these criteria. That's going to be the question.
And I can't improve on what Tyler had to say. I did want to
we did get someone asking, please, can you answer the question as well, Blake?
Oh, about fairness?
Yeah.
So I'm going to give a cop-out answer, but I mean, essentially, I don't know what to expect. And I will say also that this, I was very much involved and actually in the room watching from kind of behind from the spectator area in 2019 when maps were being drawn, or watching very closely online. This time around, I'm focused very much on local governments, county, municipality, and school board governments in North Carolina. And there are more than 100 of those that need to redistrict as well. And it's taking up a ton of my time. So I'm not, long way of saying I haven't been trying to keep really close tabs on everything going on in Raleigh. So I do want to just point out, this is another way that districts could be drawn if someone were, if this would be more likely if there were Democrats who were steering the process. But you can see here that by taking all of Rockingham County and then combining that with sort of the bluest part of Guilford County, you can get a purple district, well, purple in the sense of that's the color it is on this map, that is 57%, essentially that mirrors the percentage for the whole cluster. And districts 2 and 3 here are also in that neighborhood. So this would be 3 safe districts for Democrats that could be drawn were partisan data being taken into account, and were Democrats able to choose as they wished. I think this would likely get raise a stink and raise a challenge as far as whether folks would question whether it was drawn for anything other than partisan reasons. One other huge factor to consider, and we're going to open it up to more questions and discussion soon, is where the incumbents live. As I mentioned earlier, that's listed as a criterion, as something to consider. They didn't specify whether it was in order to avoid pairing incumbents, but that was how it was managed in 2019. And I have mapped the incumbents. And before I do this, I'm gonna just build this up. I couldn't believe what I saw when I mapped these. And that is that Senator Berger lives in Rockingham County. His location in his county isn't really that important in that his county won't be divided. But in terms of putting the Democratic incumbents, so it's currently represented by, there are two Democratic senators based in Guilford County, and they live about 1,000 feet from each other. So they're in different precincts, but if it looks like a very short walk. I don't know this neighborhood, but if I turn on a base map here, you can see the blocks. And so this kind of thing raises an interesting challenge. So just going back to the scenario we were looking at before, if we look at this scenario, this might be favorable to Democrats. This might be considered an ideal map by some, but that would mean that Senator Robinson and Senator Garrett have to run against each other. They're both in the same district, and you have to run in the district in which you reside. So that, and I can vouch for this from the local redistricting I'm doing, that it imposes significant constraints. So that is definitely something to look out for. And I expect you will see maybe sort of approximated representations of where, maybe just which precinct the incumbent senators and representatives live in. But that can really really steer what options are on the table, especially if they're trying to prevent incumbents from having to run against each other.
Great, thank you. And a couple of related questions that we've got. One in particular, if we want to use the Maptitude software but can't get to Raleigh in the General Assembly, can we do it? Is that something they can do at home?
With Maptitude software, I am not aware of that being available. Maptitude does offer a web-based product. It's called Maptitude Online Redistricting. And I know, for example, in Maryland, the state of Maryland made the web-based software available in order to encourage citizens to draw their own maps and submit those. I believe there was a process in Arizona that did that as well. So it's something that can be done, but I have not heard anything that the General Assembly has been moving in that direction of providing that specific tool. I alluded before, and maybe this has come up in other sessions, there are three great free web-based tools. One is called District Builder. I'm not listing these in any particular order. District Builder at districtbuilder.org, Dave's Redistricting app at davesredistricting.org, and Districtor, spelled with no E or no vowel, no letter between the T and the R at the end, like Flickr or Tumblr or one of these web products. So districtor.org, and those will all let you draw maps. I will say I have been in communication with the folks who work on these, and they're aware of the county grouping requirement. If you're drawing plans for the legislature, as Tyler mentioned, if it doesn't heed the county grouping, it's unlikely to be taken seriously.
And we did get two questions about where one could obtain shapefiles for VTDs and data files for demographics and voting patterns, and also where to find the county cluster maps.
Good question. So let's see if I may be able to post some URLs in the chat. Tyler, I know you've shared a bunch of data online yourself in a repository. I don't know if that covers the specific shapefiles that Melissa mentioned, but why don't, if you want to talk about that, and I'll try and get a URL. It's actually based at Duke for the county clusters.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, if you check the chat, Greg Hirschlag from the last session actually posted their paper that you know, Blake is co-authored on. For VTDs, generally what you're going to look for are the census. They're called Tiger line shape files, and that will give you a shape file that you can download and use in software like QGIS, and so that's pretty common. When the data from the maps is going to be released, ostensibly what they will do is, the legislature will do is release shapefiles as well on some of those map proposals. When that's all released and dropped, it's sort of variable. And so we'll be watching that pretty closely too. But in all of these platforms, you're actually able to import these different layers exactly like you see them here on Blake's screen. But I'm trying to think, are there other, there's a question too about for demographics and voting patterns. A lot of that you can also get from the census. Just last week or the week before, the US Census Bureau released its redistricting file data on data.census.gov. And so you can download that information specifically for different geographic shapes, counties and whatnot. And that's actually what's going to be used to draw these maps that will ostensibly stand for the next 10 years.
And Blake, would you be able to post the links that you mentioned to the drawing, the web-based drawing apps in the chat for folks?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We'll do that right now.
We've got a great question from Jane Pensky, who I think everyone knows. Hi, Jane. She says most legislators have no idea how to use the software and are as confused about it as most citizens. How can they go about empowering legislators to use and understand this kind of software? That might be a good Blake question.
Yeah. And especially coming from Jane, who has many more hours of time spent in Raleigh actually interacting with legislators than I. There are, and as far as empowering them, that's a good question. I think maybe just as an incentive, knowing that there are the statistics from some of these free tools that are out there. Dave's Redistricting app in particular has a very loyal and enthusiastic user base, and the people who built it tweet about how many maps are thousands and thousands of users and thousands of maps being drawn. So maybe just as an incentive, recognizing that so many folks are actually getting their hands on these districts. Tyler also mentioned the tools that are available. Some of the tools provide ways to sort of score plans and assess them. It just may be that sort of to keep up with where a lot of the population and a lot of the active citizenry, what they're doing, that might be something that would encourage them or empower them. I think I can't speak to whether the General Assembly provides licenses for Maptitude, but there's more of a learning curve to Maptitude than the browser-based, the free online versions. But the online versions let you do a great deal of what you can do in Maptitude. Sort of a rambling answer. Anyone else want to take a swing at doing better than I did?
Well, and I think if I remember correctly, that during the 2019 session, there were public portals that members of the public could come in and use to play around with the software. Is that, Blake, you're saying no? Was that not? Maybe that was something that was just talked about.
So for years, there has been a public redistricting workstation, and that's where I got that screenshot that I showed in the PowerPoint slides, was using that. And it's a great resource. It had been available in previous years. It is still there. I tried to use it recently and was told that it is, despite what the website said at the time, maybe this has changed. This was a few weeks ago. I couldn't actually, I was not able to use it. And in 2019, my understanding is that they did not allow access to it because the argument was that they wanted everything to be transparent and there was no way to be screencasting or publicizing what was happening in that, that room in the legislative office building. So during the process, they didn't want map drawing happening that was sort of off camera.
Okay. And to answer Jane's question in a different way, one thing I can imagine folks doing is reaching out to their specific legislature and saying, I have concerns about how maps are being drawn. I've used this program. I want to encourage you to do the same. Or, would you have time to meet and use this program together to kind of work out some of the, concerns, or go through some of the criteria together. We've got another question here. How long does the map drawing process typically take? And is it expected to take more or less time this year, and why?
I started really paying attention to this after 2011. So my experience has mostly been, and there have been plenty of redistricting happening in North Carolina since 2011, after the districts were drawn at the beginning of that decade, but it's always been ordered by courts, and it has always had sort of a short window of time. So we have seen entire statewide plans redrawn in less than a week. So it can be done. I'm thinking of that for Congress, where all the districts got redrawn. In the case of the legislative boundaries that got overturned and had to be redrawn, those were it was a subset of the entire map. So not everything had to be redrawn for those, but it can be done in fewer than 7 days. As far as what's sort of typical in the past, it has taken longer, but COVID has compressed the time frame just because the census data came out later, as I think Tyler alluded to.
Mm-hmm. When a district is not generally shape-based, it really looks like one is trying to gerrymander. This person says they're having trouble justifying not using shape-based districts. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
So this is where I think the argument really comes into play about, when we talk about shapes. I mean, first off, are we talking about circles or squares? Are we using the precincts, which you can see have their own shapes and to them? But the fact is that compactness is a criteria, but not the only one. If you think about the reason why we are choosing, areas that electors are going to be represented, it's basic idea that these folks are going to be representing communities and not necessarily squares and circles. Now, you can argue that they should be representing squares and circles. I'm not saying that's wrong, but one I think pretty good argument is that how you define communities is sort of the essential question that the U.S. Constitution charges state legislatures with, right? Are we gonna put everybody in a county together, or a city, or two cities, or farmland, or the urban core, or a fire district, or a flood district, or a historically disenfranchised Black community that for the first time think about in the middle of the 1900s was going to be able to get a voice in politics. So these are all considerations that in some ways clash, and I think it's real easy to think that we can just draw sort of pretty shapes and that will solve the problem. But there's going to be an argument on the other side that those shapes might split a community. They might cleave, a university in half, or they might, cleave a Hispanic neighborhood in half, or, a farming community in half. And I think none of those arguments are right or wrong, but they have to be had. I think that's the discussion that's really important about this. And I think to speak to some of these, the thinking about what a shape should look like, sometimes shapes should be ugly for good reasons. And I think we should be able to ask what those reasons are, and map makers should articulate them. And I think that might be a good test, way to think about it.
Absolutely. We have just a couple more minutes. Somebody asked, are there things we should be watching or listening for as the maps are drawn?
Melissa, you were kind of covering this as a journalist in 2019 and very present. What are your thoughts?
I think similar to what Tyler just said, the more important thing is being able to ask questions. Certainly if you heard someone, a legislator talking about race or partisan data, those are things that absolutely should not be used, as the courts have decided. And so listening out for that is one thing that you can do. And but in terms of watching, and listening, watching and being able to ask questions is the most important part. So if you see if you see part of the map is being drawn in one of these weird shapes, being able to ask, hey, what is the reason for this? Or, being able to ask, well, what would it look like if we didn't split up this community? Or, I don't want my legislators double bunked. If they are double bunked, so to speak, in the same district and would have to run together, being able to say, why was that done? What other criteria was considered? And that's about all the time that we have today. I want to thank Tyler and Blake for being part of this panel, and also just let everyone know that there's a break here in between panels, but there are 3 more afternoon hybrid panels focused specifically on the process in North Carolina, the redistricting process. And they're open in person to individuals with a Duke ID and virtually to the general public. And we will reconvene at 12:15. Thank you all so much for joining us. And, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have more questions. We're happy to help.